as in fact we expect will happen here today. Then the professor ended by saying, young man, you are scandalously articulate. It was a famous statement that was repeated. It was a legendary statement that was repeated across generations at that time. So we are honored to have him here from SOAS. But I guess my part for the morning is already done. It's a 2-hour event. We'll be rounding up by 2 p.m. So definitely, Professor Imafidon will speak for 45 minutes, 1 hour. And then the chair moderator, in the person of Dr. Richmond, who is also the history of philosophy, will take questions and then moderate. At the moment, I'm handing over to the HU, and please to, at first, introduce the guest speaker. Thank you, Dr. Wesley.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chika. I hope those online can hear very well, because we will want to start and then so if we can check that those who are joined online can hear everything clearly. Right. Can anyone online just let us know whether they can hear us? Yes, so anyone can unmute and say something or type if they can hear us. Okay, they can hear us.
We can hear you, but we can't hear the speakers.
Oh, you can hear me? Okay, so they've confirmed they can hear us. That is great. Okay, so once again, thank you all for coming. We welcome you to the Institute of African Studies and to the Philosophy and Classics Department. And we are very honored to have Professor Elvis Imafidon to give this lecture in these two departments. So I'll just give a brief introduction, a brief biography of Professor Elvis Imafidon, and then we'll hand over for Paul to give his lecture. So Prof is an associate professor in African philosophy and also the chair of the Center for Global and Comparative Philosophies at SOAS, University of London. He is also a research associate at the African Center for Ethnology and the Philosophy of Science at the University of Johannesburg. His research interests include African philosophy, the philosophy of difference, the philosophy of corporeality, the philosophy of healthcare, ethics, and ontology, primarily from African philosophical perspectives. He is the author and editor of several books, including Ontologized Ethics, New Essays in African Metaethics, which was published by Lexington Books in 2014. Another book is Ethics of Subjectivity, Perspectives Since the Dawn of Modernity, of Pelgrim and 2015. He has another book titled African Philosophy and the Otherness of Albinism, White Skin, Black Race, Routledge 2019. And the Handbook of African Philosophy of Difference, Springer 2020. And the Handbook of African Philosophy and African Philosophy and Deep Ecology, which is forthcoming. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to our invited speaker.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. much, Dr. Kwesi and Dr. Chika. Thank you. To the philosophy department, philosophy and classics department, and the Institute of African Studies. It's been a pleasure being here. I've been here for about 6 days now, and maybe I've added about 3 kg thanks to Richmond and Chika. I've been eating a lot of delicious Ghanaian food, and it's been beautiful moving around the museum and a number of places. So I'm very grateful to be here. Chika said a bit about my philosophical journey, and I'll just say a bit more. I did my undergraduate and graduate studies in Nigeria, and what I found, and I'm sure I have one of my lecturers here, Professor Redefining, and quite a few lecturers here. He taught me post-analytic philosophy, so he's one of those brains of the University of Ibadan that I passed through. And I'm sure students will also be able to relate to some of the things I will say about my undergraduate studies. It's a 4-year program, and generally you are, in a sense, deeply immersed in this study of Western philosophy. You begin with sort of the pre-Socratics, and then the Socratic philosophers, the medieval philosophers, Anselm, Aquinas. Then you move on to early modern, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, the late modern, Kant, Hegel, and then the contemporary, John Ross. And so these obviously are names that even students of philosophy here, and even of African studies, will be familiar with, right? So in a sense, and of course, I feel this is something, there's quite a similar experience here in Ghana, right? And in most part of the world. So in a sense, there's quite a global pedagogical structure of philosophy that is essentially Eurocentric. I don't know, is the slide being shared or where's the IT? Yeah, so I'll just go on. When it shares it, then I can move it to the right place. So what this implies is the global dominance of the Western tradition of philosophy. This idea of dominance is framed in a way that presents Western philosophy as the prototype of philosophy that does philosophy differently from other traditions, in the way in which it is systematic, technical, and professional, sort of setting the standards for the academic community. Thus, a distinction is often drawn between the philosophy of the West and a sort of suspicious philosophy of the rest. This distinction, I think, is very nicely captured in one of the pioneering figures of the work of one of the pioneering figures of African philosophy, contemporary African philosophy, I would like to call it, D.A. Masolo. Some of you may have heard of the book, African Philosophy in Search of Identity. I'll quote him. He says, "There are two senses of the word philosophy, but with a good deal of relation to each other." And I'd like you to pay very close attention to what's being said here. The words are very important. The first sense is usually also called the ordinary sense and refers to some kind of opinions and commitments to certain ideas or ways of interpreting things, to values and beliefs about the general nature of things. This sense of philosophy is quite reflective and can sometimes be argued even vigorously. The argument in it, however, are usually also sort of established opinions, views, and related beliefs, which are called upon for justification. This is the sense, this ordinary sense of philosophy, this is the sense of philosophy which is usually expressed in the form, "my philosophy is." In this sense, philosophy can be held by individuals and be assumed of group communities, societies, and so on, as part of the covert culture which is made up of the reason behind the observable cultural practices and expressions. Then he goes on to talk about this other sense of philosophy, the second sense. And I quote him: in the second sense, philosophy is what appears as the main subject of most of the writings of Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, Hegel, Pastorius, Portonji, and others. So if you take notes, it shifts very quickly to specific individuals in the past mostly. In this sense, philosophy is a commitment to an investigation rather than to any specific idea or opinion. It is the study of a variety of subjects from a specific type of approach, an open, rational analysis and synthesis, and can therefore not be expressed in the form my philosophy is, because it is not merely a body of opinion and does not aim primarily at formulating workable principles, but rather at understanding philosophy in this sense becomes primarily an academic practice, a study, a systematic investigation of ideas. Let's see. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, another way of drawing this distinction between the philosophy of the West, the sort of technical, professional sense of philosophy, and the philosophy of the rest, ordinary philosophy, is the decision between philosophy as a method for technical professional investigation and philosophy as worldview. Jean Bullock in 1999 draws this distinction in his book Comparative Philosophy between East and West. Every society, based on this understanding, could be said to have a philosophy in the sense of worldviews, such as their philosophy of life or existence and their philosophy of the good. But in the more technical sense, it indicates a particular dominant, as it were, methodology, a specialized way of investigating and organizing ideas that are taught in universities, one that is critical, logical, analytical, and systematic. So in this sense, not everyone has a philosophy. And it is the sort of philosophy that arose at a particular point in Greek history. So I have read many of these kind of distinctions, right, aimed at presenting Western philosophy as the shining example of how philosophy ought to be done. It is either I am too unphilosophical or perhaps not rationally sophisticated enough to understand this distinction, or my suspicion of the glaring illogicality and meaninglessness of this distinction is right. So I'll leave you to decide. Consider for a moment these questions, and I don't plan to answer them, I just want you to have them in mind. Isn't philosophy in the so-called technical and professional sense also about the formulation of fundamental ideas and opinions, principles, worldviews, and theories of being, of knowledge, of beauty, and human action? In other words, are the so-called worldviews and ordinary philosophies not also deeply rooted in Western professional philosophy? Are the allegedly grandiose and exalted philosophies of the West not a form of my philosophies? And here are a few examples. When Plato, Descartes, Kant theorized the immortality of the soul and the world of forms, the cogito ergo sum, and the categorical imperative, respectively, were they not postulating some kind of subjective idea of being, some kind of my philosophies? Or should we continue to hold to the idea that these philosophies were mere vehicles for abstract? These philosophers were sort of vehicles for abstract reasoning that produced infallible and objective universal truths. What is the possibility of arriving at a philosophy of life, or a philosophy of existence, or an ethic of the good in communities with so-called ordinary philosophy, without going through a systematic, critical, and analytical reflection on lived experiences? So, I am leaving you with these sort of rhetoric questions to think about as we go through this talk. So, So the idea of a dominant philosophical tradition is therefore used primarily to argue that philosophy as an intellectual tradition is the exclusive preserve of Europe. And in less extreme cases, some would then argue, well, although Europe dominates in showcasing philosophy, there are a few other traditions that mimics it, that can do it like it does it, that can mirror it, right? One philosopher who has made this argument is Benjamin Shafstein in the 1998 book, A Comparative History of Philosophy. He argues vehemently that there are only three philosophical traditions: the European first, and then the Chinese and the Indian. In presenting this defense, Shafstein has developed a definition of a philosophical tradition that is a good summary of what we've been speaking about in terms of how Eurocentrism dominates the discipline of philosophy. And here is his definition, I'll quote him. He says, what is a philosophical tradition? A chain of persons who relate their thought to that of their predecessor, and in this way form a continuous transmission from one generation to the next, from teacher to disciple, to disciples to disciples. So again, there's an emphasis on the individual here. Or rather, because a whole tradition is made up of many sub-traditions, it is one and the same tradition because all of its sub-traditions share common sources and modes of thought and develop by reaction to one another. A tradition is by nature cumulative, and it progresses in the sense that it defines itself with increasing detail and density. And it continues, I define the tradition as philosophical to the extent that its members articulate it in the form of principles, if only principles of interpretation, and of conclusions reasonably drawn from them. And I define it as philosophical to the extent that its adherents defend and attack by means of reasonable arguments. On the basis of this definition of a philosophical tradition, Shafstein then concludes that there are three traditions: Europe, China, and India. And I quote him here, he says, why say that there are only three great traditions or philosophical traditions? To claim this, one must put aside the correct, I find this strange, the correct but for our purpose, insufficient definition of philosophy as wisdom or as a group of principles either stated or implied, by which any person or community views life. This implies that ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt had no philosophical traditions. This implication holds true even though the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians had religious texts that show that they were trying to grasp universal and permanent principles that lie below the surface of things. So Shafstein thus shares this sentiment that we'll be looking at earlier, definition of philosophy that distinguishes between the technical, professional sense of philosophy from philosophy as the pursuit of wisdom and the search for principles, by asking us to put that aside, in a sense, not to consider that etymological definition of philosophy. With reference particularly to African philosophy, it is Shafstein's view that Africa had no tradition of philosophy, and only recently in the second half of the 20th century, due to the pioneering work of professional African philosophers, is such an African tradition of philosophy beginning to be born. And he sort of justifies this or legitimates this position by co-opting the views of philosophers like Kwasi Wiredu and Otunju. He says, for example, about Kwasi Wiredu, in essential agreement with my restrictive definition of philosophy, Kwasi Wiredu, and take notice, he sort of qualifies him, Kwasi Wiredu, an Oxford-educated philosopher from Ghana, considers traditional African thoughts, however humanistic, to be merely a folk philosophy. And so he uses sort of quotes African philosophers to defend his view. So there are some key points that stand out in this whole talk about the Eurocentrism of philosophy and of the philosophical tradition. They include the emphasis on individual authorship, on textuality of the tradition, on the transgenerational coherency of tradition, on literacy, on politics of naming, and the whiteness of philosophy. For the sake of time, I will look at three of these features: individual authorship, textuality, and whiteness and literacy. And I will explain what these things mean and invite you to challenge. So, concerning individual authorship, one of the key features of a philosophical tradition, as dominantly understood in academia, is that in this intellectual tradition, the philosophical ideas, concepts, theories, debates, and arguments are produced and authored by individuals. And this is what Schaffstein, that I quoted earlier, captures when he talks about how it develops from teacher to disciples, right? I refer to this key defining feature as individual authorship, where philosophical knowledge and ways of philosophizing are attributed to identifiable and specific individuals in the history. So we recall Maslow, for example, saying philosophy in the technical sense is the kind of things produced by Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, identify specific individuals. These individuals take credit for original contribution to the development of the tradition of philosophy, such as in terms of the ideas and methods that were generated. They enjoy recognition for and ownership of the contribution they make, but also they are held accountable for the philosophies they produced, as recently we hold people like Kant or Hegel responsible for their ideas, right? A philosophical tradition is thus conventionally understood to be developed by identifiable individuals over a long period of time, such that there is also transgenerational coherence. Individual authorship is therefore the fundamental criterion for presenting the conventional history of philosophy, that is the Greek, European, Western history. And we only need to pick up a history book, a history of philosophy textbook in the library, and you encounter these individuals. If you pick up a history of philosophy textbook, what you will see would be the pre-Socratics, the Socratics, so on and so forth. Once established as a defining feature of the dominant philosophical tradition, individual authorship then becomes a basis for the rejection of traditions often labeled as ordinary or folk philosophy or cultural philosophy, due to the unfelt presence of numerous individuals independently authoring philosophy in such traditions. To claim that a group of people have a philosophical tradition would be therefore to claim that one can show evidence of individual authors in that tradition that have coherently developed it. So it explains why many say African philosophy did not begin until the 1940s and 1950s, where there were individuals who were developing it. Anonymous authors of philosophy or philosophical knowledge collectively produced by groups of groups that have collaboratively authored that knowledge would become difficult to admit as philosophy. Folk philosophy would become at best some sort of raw material or object of discourse for the real philosopher, the real individual philosopher to analyze. This knowing subject, this individual authoring philosophy, is thus presented as if standing back, detached away from the culture and folklore he or she philosophizes about, and as if he or she is not in the first place shaped and influenced by that culture, by its language and the thought within that place. The privileging of individual authorship in the definition of a philosophical tradition raises at least two key challenges that I would like you to think about. First is the trivialization of collective epistemic agency, and the second is the holism individualism challenge in relation to the epistemic canon of philosophy. Concerning the first, the privileging of individual authors as the sole source, the only source of philosophical knowledge, treats as trivial or unimportant group knowledge, collective epistemic agency, epistemic heritages, and collaborative efforts in doing philosophy. The idea of collective agency in knowledge production, even within philosophical knowledge, is the acknowledgement that in human traditions, down the ages, there has always been this sort of codependency and cooperation and solidarity in knowing the world around us, such that if we were to be sincere with ourselves, individual authorship would always be hanging on the balance. This collectiveness and relationality in knowledge production and the epistemic heritages that we have, such as language, group-head worldviews and beliefs that individuals draw on in producing their ideas, may in many cases be suppressed and not even acknowledged due to the deeply entrenched politics of cognition in spaces of human dwelling, where the one or the few with the louder voice and with the institutional power to proclaim, so that the power to publish in books or air in media, what has been collectively produced seize ownership and authorship. To be sure, there are clear and specific manifestations of individual cognition in which the cognizer deserves credit as an individual for the excellent contribution they've made to the cognitive process. But even such cognition would not come to be without the support from a wider community of cognizers. But the dominant understanding of cognition that we have is one that is purely objective, self-contained, something you achieve on your own. And it blinds us to this salient point of solidarity in cognition, always shifting our attention from the intersubjective and communal to the individual and objective. So, I'm sure many of us will be familiar with Plato's dialogue, for example, right? So when we think, for example, of the dialogues of Plato and the nature in which they have been textually presented and represented to us in human history, one cannot help but notice this trivialization of the collective and the elevation of the individual self. The very title, the conventional title, Dialogues of Plato, is paradoxical because dialogues and conversations cannot be of an individual. You cannot say dialogues of Plato. Plato cannot dialogue with himself. Dialogues is always of individuals who come together to have conversation. And we know for certain that there were several persons involved in the dialogues, such as Socrates, who was often the major character. So the popular idea the popular idea that Plato is the author, and this is often a common quote, the philosophical architect of the dialogue, is perhaps an idea that we do not question enough. So think, for example, of one of the dialogues, the Theaetetus, which is always about knowledge, right? When we read through the Theaetetus, we can identify several individuals involved in that dialogue. We can see Euclides, Socrates, Theodorus, and Theaetetus himself. Interestingly, Plato is not even part of those who were involved in that dialogue. Plato simply became the author primarily for being the individual that produced the text. So again, the moment it was produced into a text, the person who did it, Plato, became the author of the text. Would this not amount to academic dishonesty and fraud today? Would the epistemically responsible thing to do not be to list the actual interlocutors involved in that dialogue as authors, and then list Plato only as the editor? And that's what we do today, actually. This attitude of taking ownership of knowledge that may have been collaboratively achieved permeates philosophy in particular and academia in general. And perhaps I think we are all in one way or the other guilty, really. We rely heavily on epistemic heritages, such as language, and knowledge, and information acquired through being part of a community, learning and education. We benefit from discussions and conversations with students, friends, and colleagues in classrooms, offices, hallways, conferences, pubs, seminars, and other public spaces. Discussions and conversations that often spark and bring to life those hidden ideas and intellectual journeys that are credited to us and us alone, right? In reality, what is perhaps truly ours as an intellectual in, say, an essay or in a book may be no more than sprinkles, right? Sprinkles on this sort of collectively baked cake, right? For those of you who do baking. What you've contributed may not be more than the icing itself, right? And how you did the icing, so your method of doing that. And how that icing beautified the cake, sort of your contribution to knowledge. We have found ways to acknowledge to a certain degree, I must admit, the collaboration in knowledge production. So in books you find acknowledgement, in essays and books you find references, referring to books you have consulted and so on. But more important, it seems to me, is the acknowledgement of intellectual humility, the acknowledgement of collaborative cognition, and the relational way in which we produce knowledge. Beyond our dependence on and collaboration with others for knowledge, and the question that this raises in relation to the idea of individual authorship, there is an even more significant challenge to individual authorship. And this is the idea of holism and the holism-individualism debate, which is a big one in different branches of philosophy. We know that we can speak meaningfully of group knowledge by saying, for example, the Christians know so and so, scientists know so and so, the accountants know so and so. We can also meaningfully speak about group philosophy. It's everywhere in published work: Greek philosophy, German philosophy, Yoruba philosophy, Mexican philosophy, Akan philosophy, and so on. So when we speak, when we refer to Greek philosophy or German philosophy, do the sum of the work of the individual Greek and German philosophers in that group, does it constitute what we understand as the group philosophy, or is there more to it? The typical holism individualism debate. German philosophy, for example, is in German philosophy is the sum of the philosophy of all German philosophers. Or is there something beyond that? Is there an epistemic heritage that goes beyond the sum of all German philosophers? To include, for example, commitment to specific ideologies and ontologies, the use of language, and so on. So, for example, German philosophy cannot thus be understood solely as the combination of all German philosophers and their thoughts. It's hard, for example, to understand the work of Heidegger if you don't speak German. You will struggle to read the translation of Being and Time because of those German concepts that you are not familiar with, right? And that's because Heidegger's work as an individual drew heavily from the epistemic heritage he inherited. He often compared Greek concepts with German concepts, and someone not within that group may struggle to make sense of that comparison. Of course, there's still a lot to say about the idea of individual authorship and the challenges it brings, but I will leave that for further conversations, checking the time, and move on to the second key feature, textuality itself. The idea of textuality as a second defining feature of philosophical tradition is that it's understood in this as a sort of, do I put it? It conveys the idea that texts or written books within that tradition form a coherent, structured, and meaningful body of knowledge about that tradition. The whole purpose of text in a philosophical tradition, authored by individuals in that tradition, will in some way amount to the complete heritage of that tradition. Western philosophy mobilizes all facets of textuality, such as intratextuality, intertextuality, materiality, genre, style, convention, and so on, and authorship, available in its tradition to argue for its place in owning the discipline. For example, the intertextual relationship between Heidegger's texts and those of the pre-Socratics, Parmenides and others, because Heidegger himself draws heavily on Greek concepts, would make for a fine argument of intertextuality over a long period of time. Having asserted its place in philosophy, the West can then, out of generosity, in a sense, screen other traditions to see which one resembles itself in being faithful to textuality, and on this basis determine who is or who is not qualified to be admitted into the hall of philosophy. The specific qualifying notion in this sense would be that to show that a tradition has philosophy, for Akan people to show that they have a philosophy, for example, it must showcase its philosophical texts that it has used to preserve and transmit its philosophical knowledge from one generation to another. The absence of or lack of such consistent presence of text would then imply an absence of a philosophical tradition. That's how the argument goes. This understanding of the textuality of philosophy has been crucial in the denial of the existence of African philosophy prior to the existence of texts that could be classified as African philosophical texts, and that only started, say, in the 1940s and 1950s. So we may recall, for example, when Pauline Hortonji wrote, and I quote him, "By African philosophy, I mean a set of texts," right? Specifically, the set of texts written by Africans and described as philosophical by their authors themselves. That's how Pauline Hortonji defined African philosophy. African philosophy, it continues, is a body of literature whose existence is undeniable, a bibliography which has grown constantly over the last 30 years. And he wrote that his famous book in 1983, so about from the 1950s, 1940s. By implication, an African philosophical tradition is non-existent, at least not until one began developing, and still in the process of developing since the 1950s. This embrace of textuality in African philosophy, in a bid to be like the hegemon of philosophy, the West, has implications for the discipline. More so, the very idea of textuality in Western philosophy raises a few questions worth paying attention to, and this is where I like to always invite the audience to think with me. So let's begin by saying a few things about the politics of materiality and intertextuality inherent in the idea of textuality. I keep forgetting to move this slide anyway. So the politics of materiality and intertextuality in this textuality discourse consists of examining and understanding the power structures and dynamics of what can be considered texts on the one hand, and what can be determined, or what can determine the coherency of many texts over a long period of time. It also consists of such an understanding, of how such an understanding shapes what is included into the textual corpus or canon, or what can be excluded from it. For example, in terms of the materiality of text, the matter of text, or the physical form of a text, in scripting a textual history of philosophy, do the use of hieroglyphs and logograms receive the same treatment and acknowledgement as the use of alphabets, or are alphabets much more privileged than they are? You know who uses logograms? The Chinese, for example. Who uses hieroglyphs? The Akans, the Yorubas. Are they not form of texting or scripting? Would ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, Yoruba hieroglyphs, or Akan Adinkra symbols have the same standing as English or French alphabets? are papers and inks more privileged and desired in this textual history than, say, papyrus or walls or clay tablets or parchment or stones and metals? I do not intend to answer these questions. I believe you're already thinking as to what exactly is the text. I believe we have a fair knowledge of the textual history before us to determine what the glaring answers are. To be sure, the argument for alphabets over the rest often revolves around preferences for simplicity, representation of sound, durability, straightforward readability, and ease of production over complexity. Representations of words, stories, ideas, and experiences, that these are much more non-durable, much more complicated when you don't do it with alphabets, when you do it in symbolic forms and so on and so forth. But these preferences have nothing, or perhaps very little, to do with the knowledge and wisdom inherent in all forms of textuality or scripting. For it is only human nature, it's just simply ethically human to script and to do it in different ways, whether on paper or wood, on tablets or whatever, even on bodies, right? Also, the idea that alphabetical texts and scripts are preferable is based on a constructed narrative, as none of the reasons profiled are beyond questioning. For example, the simplicity of alphabets is no doubt contextual and not universal. How many percentage of Africa can read an English text, right? Is it really simple? The politics of textuality is even more obvious in the claim of intertextuality. Who determines what texts are intertwined and the conditions that make such intertwining possible? Does the quest to showcase intertextuality not deliberately or perhaps non-deliberately lead to the exclusion of certain texts? And are texts only intertwinable with other texts? Can text not be intertwined with orality or with symbols? We see clearly from the recent history of Western philosophy that many women and their writings were excluded and neglected in the dominant narrative of the history of Western philosophy, partly due to the exertion of patriarchy, partly due to the need to achieve this coherent textuality. What the politics of textuality brings to mind is that the very idea of textuality is portrayed and narrated in specific ways that are favorable to the dominant tradition of philosophy and could potentially exclude other traditions. But even if we agree to go by the Western narrative of textuality that aims to portray texts as different from, say, non-textual forms of knowledge, such as symbolism and so on, we will still run into other challenges. So one of such challenges is how it undermines non-textual repositories of knowledge, even in ways that contradict the history of Western philosophy. A typical example is the Socratic puzzle. I believe some of you would have heard of the Socratic puzzle, the enduring debate in the history of Western philosophy as to whether Socrates existed, right? Or whether he was simply the creation of Plato. Why do we have that debate? Because you can't find a text written by Socrates, right? And so there's this puzzle: did he exist? Did he not exist? Because the orality is not enough. I'm sure the University of Ghana and many universities would not offer Socrates a lectureship position if he was alive today, because he would have to prove that he has written texts and articles and published all over the place before he could, because that's the sort of reality we live in. We live in a textual academia. And again, Socrates was always fond of a conversational and collaborative style of philosophy. That was his own style for doing philosophy, and which sort of departs from this emphasis on individual authorship that we've examined and the focus on text. So the focus on text could make us look the other way when we are searching for philosophy, insofar as we are not finding it in text, even when it's staring right us in the face, in symbols and in oral forms of knowledge. one last challenge before I move to the last feature is that of privileging text is the category mistake. So it is a category mistake to present texts as philosophical knowledge in itself. Texts are not themselves synonymous with philosophical knowledge. Texts are repositories, they are storages for philosophical knowledge. Philosophical knowledge emerge from solitary collaborative processes that showcase that fondness, that quest, that search for wisdom. Text, speech, symbols are only ways of capturing that process and not necessarily the process itself. For we do not write before we think, do we? Or what to write, we do not think of what to write before we, would not write before we start thinking of what should I write? You know, we do not write before we enter into a dialogue. So writing is only a repository, it's not the actual process. So texts always have existed side by side non-textual forms of knowledge in human cultures. In the seeming embrace and the centering of text and the sort of exclusion, marginalization of non-textual forms of knowledge, the texts produced by individual African philosophers are still very much saturated and profusely permeated with references to non-textual forms. We talk a lot about proverbs, adages, maxims from different cultures. The Akan says, the Yoruba says, the Igbo says. We're drawing a lot from the non-textual in our texts, and yet we perhaps are not acknowledging it enough. Let me turn to the final, which I think is crucial, whiteness and literacy, because they are of course very much, I think I've I've pressed the wrong thing here. So, ingrained in this dominant idea of the philosophical tradition are the qualities of whiteness and literacy that's been carefully curated and constructed in ways that serve the colonizing and hegemonic agenda of the West. In this understanding, to do philosophy or to have the ability to philosophize is intrinsically interwoven with being white or being literate in a white way. These features of Western philosophical tradition, particularly in relation to how they are deployed in latently stating the non-existence of African philosophy, are presented and represented in subtle, sometimes radical ways in theories of racial hierarchies, eugenics, and colonization that dominated and has dominated Enlightenment philosophy. When Immanuel Kant wrote, for example, about racial hierarchies and how the white race was the perfect race than other race, with the black race with little or no cognitive function, when David Hume reiterated similar views about the inability of thought for black people, and when Hegel considered Africa as ahistorical, not part of history, there was a deliberate narrative of the whiteness of philosophy being curated by these so-called great minds of the Enlightenment period. And such narratives have had significant impact on our received view of philosophy today. The whiteness of philosophy means at least two things. First, it means that only a certain group of people who claim to have a tradition of philosophy or lay claim to the ownership of philosophy, and other human traditions claiming to have an authentic philosophical system of their own would be considered to have produced a sort of pseudo kind of philosophy inferior to that of the West, or would have to owe their philosophical trajectory to the West. Schaffstein, this same guy I've been speaking of for a while, talks about, for example, Jewish and Islamic tradition. He says something about it's because of pride that we want to argue that we have our own tradition that did not depend on European tradition. You know, he cites Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and how they depended very exclusively on Aristotle, for example. So there's this idea that any other tradition would have to owe their existence to the Western tradition. Second, it means that for any group of people to be able to claim to have a philosophical tradition or system, or to develop one, it will have to undergo what I would like to call a whitening process, right? A process that actively suspends and gradually erases the heritage and identity of the group of people while embracing the identity and heritage of whiteness. With particular reference to the African experience of this whitening process, which was obviously the crux of colonization and ongoing neocolonization, it has been achieved the process has been to achieve the assimilation of Africans, of the white ways of doing things, doing philosophy, obviously, while rejecting, suspending, or erasing African ways. And key to this whitening process, is the idea of literacy, meant to replace a so-called constructed idea of African illiteracy. With particular reference to philosophy, this meant abandoning one's ways of learning, one's language and epistemic structure for the Western ways of learning and for Western languages. And with particular reference to African experience, it meant that speaking an African language and learning and co-learning and pursuing wisdom the African way would constitute some sort of illiteracy, while speaking, reading and writing, say English or French or Spanish, and learning within a formal setting would be considered literacy, right? So for example, this whitening process produced a distinction in African places between formal literate language, the language of the West, and vernacular. I'm sure that's a common word that you'll be familiar with, and vernacular illiterate languages, African languages. And this vernacularization of African languages has resulted in the distancing of Africans from their own language in the pursuit of literacy. But if language is the house of being, if language is used to capture one's experience of reality and one's ideas about reality, what happens when you are distanced from that language? Obviously, you end up not being able to assess that philosophy or those ideas. So there are several problems with the imposition and gradual assimilation of whiteness and literacy as conditions or benchmarks for doing philosophy within the African context. One of such challenge is in relation to whiteness is the possibility of taking whiteness as a fact or an actual state of reality rather than for what it is, a deliberate construction and radical coloring of race for purpose of power and dominance and for sustaining a radical dichotomy of the self, that is the white, from the other, the non-white. In terms of doing philosophy, it would mean assimilating and promoting the philosophy that emerges from whiteness as superior to the philosophy that emerges from blackness, in a sense, which, if at all existent, is of sort of inferior kind. It is thus quite a reductionist approach to thinking about philosophy and the philosophical tradition that reduces the rich, diverse, and robust philosophical traditions of the world to the Western, or anything that resembles the Western. Of course, the second challenge would be that the streamlining of philosophy to what has been captured in written form in specific Western languages and transmitted and learned in those specific Western pedagogical ways. And of course, this is problematic because it will mean that, again, as I said earlier, you lose out of the rich linguistic concepts in other languages that we end up not focusing on. So, having talked about these three key issues, and of course there are many more to talk about, what then is a philosophical tradition? What we'll perhaps be demonstrating in the last, say, 46 minutes is what a philosophical tradition cannot be reduced to. the contestation so far show that the philosophical tradition is not reducible to a purely textual tradition, or the philosophical ideas produced or authored only by specific individuals. They also show clearly that philosophical tradition is not owned by the West alone. So how then can we begin rethinking to how to define a philosophical tradition? Well, I'll suggest three important features that helps us to think about a more robust and inclusive way of defining a philosophical tradition. Of course, to be sure, these features should already be sort of discernible from our discussion so far. A philosophical tradition, I think, is an epistemic tradition. It's a tradition is basically one of the things it does is to move knowledge from one generation to another. So it's an epistemic tradition in that it produces philosophical knowledge, and it is driven and validated by at least three features. There could be more. And I identify these features as epistemic commitment, epistemic durability, and epistemic humility. A philosophical tradition is epistemically committed insofar as it showcases and demonstrates a sustained commitment to the pursuit of wisdom, the asking and answering of philosophical questions and puzzles, the development of specific methods for doing so, and to the production and revision of philosophical ideas, concepts, and theories. Who does the asking and answering, whether an individual or a group? Who develops the method and produces philosophical knowledge, be it an individual or a community of selves, becomes secondary to the actual performance of these philosophical activities. And of course, the question would be, do Africans, or has African communities developed or showcased epistemic commitment in producing knowledge, be it in oral forms, proverbs, folklores, maxims, or in symbolic forms like the Adikra symbols, the Ifa symbols, and so on? And if your answer is yes, then it allows for the inclusion of diverse epistemic agents, not just individuals, but groups, into the global heritage called philosophy. A philosophical tradition is epistemically durable insofar as it is capable of sustaining, preserving, and transmitting over a long period of time its philosophical knowledges and methods, resisting as it were external and internal attempts to break, deteriorate, or minimize it. I've been in Accra for the past 6 days. I've visited several museums. I've got some books from the bookshop, and the fact that I can still have access to Ga symbols, Adikra symbols, to proverbs, means that the tradition has been epistemically durable, even after the advent of slavery and colonization. The specific repositories developed for achieving this durability, be it textual, non-textual, or a blend of both, becomes secondary to the actual process of achieving durability. This, of course, acknowledges and allows for flexibility in how the durability of a tradition is accomplished, bearing in mind that different methods for doing so may dominate different phases of human history. And finally, a philosophical tradition showcases epistemic humility, and I think this is always what is lacking in Eurocentrism, by deliberately or inadvertently acknowledging the fallibility of knowledge and of one's system, the possibility of other perspectives, and the possibility of revision to previously held perspectives as the dialogue unfolds. When we think about the African encounter with the West, and how that was dominated with, at first, this hospitality, this welcoming, wanting to learn something new, without knowing that the one we are learning from had their own agenda, which was very, in many ways, violent against us. Epistemic humility does not threaten authenticity or reliability or the robustness of a tradition, but it rather affirms it. for one realization that is commonly shared in the many traditions of philosophy is their fondness for and pursuit of wisdom that is fallible, that is always needing revision, that is always needing a better understanding. So thinking about a philosophical tradition in these terms of epistemic durability, commitment, and humility, we see that Western tradition of philosophy and the emphasis on individual authorship, textuality, whiteness, and transgenerationality leads to an exclusion of several other human traditions from the philosophical circle. But thinking about it from this idea of being an epistemic tradition that is humble, durable, and responsive, opens it to not just the African tradition of philosophy and helps us to pay close attention to what we have, but to other traditions of philosophy. And I think I will stop talking there and look forward to a good conversation.
Okay, I hope this works. Thank you very much, Professor Elvis Imafidon, for that very insightful talk. So the talk is, as you can glean from it, at least in two parts. One is to raise challenges to this constructed way of understanding what a tradition is, and what a philosophical tradition is. And one of those constructed ideas about what a tradition is when it is understood in terms of individual authorship and at the mercy of trying to jettison collective authorship, or when the emphasis is on text and materials, or when the emphasis is on whiteness. And I liked the fact that if you want to join this tradition, you have to go through or undergo a process of whitening to be able to to be eligible to be part of the tradition. And I guess the second part of the talk is once you challenge those ways of understanding tradition, the suggestion is that we need to rethink that notion of tradition and then go in for what he calls the epistemic commitment, epistemic